Hey guys, I know you're enjoying your snow days, but I figured that after having a few days off, if you've even touched your homework, you might need a quick review on completing the square and that whole process. So I'm going to use this video to do that. Let's first remember what our perfect square trinomial looks like. This is an example of one, x squared minus 10x plus 25, and that of course would factor into x minus 5 squared. If we FOILed that, we would of course end up with this perfect square trinomial here. So with completing the square, we are working towards this on one side of our equation. That's the whole point, is that we end up with identical factors that we would square, and then we'll square root both sides and that whole bit. And also remember with the perfect square trinomials, if you take our c value, remember this is like if there was a 1 here, that would be our a, b would be negative 10, and then c would be 25. If we took the square root of c, which would be 5, and then multiplied that by 2, we should get our middle term here. And that could be plus or minus 5, and then basically whatever the sign is on b, that's what's going to go inside your factorization there. Okay, so let's start with this one. We've got x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 2. Now the first thing you want to do is make room for you to create the perfect square trinomial. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to find the value of c that makes this right here a perfect square trinomial. So the first thing you're going to do is get rid of the existing c value that's there. So just like in any equation, we're going to use our opposite operation. So you're going to add 1 to both sides. And then you want to leave a hole where the c value was, because we're going to fill that with a new value that makes this a perfect square trinomial. So over here we end up with 3. Okay, to find your c value, you're going to take your b, which in our case is negative 2. We're going to take half of that, which would be negative 1, and square it. So negative 1 times negative 1, or negative 1 squared, is a positive 1. So we're going to add that there. And because this is an equation, we have to keep this scale balanced. So if we add 1 here, we also have to add 1 on this side as well. I'm going to rewrite and clean that up. Okay. Now, we are ready to do our factorization. Remember, we should end up with identical factors. So here, we're going to split this into something squared, and on here, we're going to have the 4. Okay. So this, of course, will factor into x, and that's a minus sign there, so that tells us our sign inside the factorization will be negative. And then we're going to have a 1. Negative 1 squared is positive 1, and then if we FOIL it, we would end up with minus x plus another minus x, or negative x plus a negative x, which would be negative 2x. So that does check out. If you need to FOIL this out to double check yourself, then please do that. Okay, we are now ready to continue with solving by taking the square root of both sides. And we're doing that because we want to get this x minus 1 outside of those parentheses. We want to get rid of that squared term right there, or the exponent. So taking the square root will cancel out the exponent of 2. So after doing that, we have x minus 1 equals, don't forget the plus or minus, the square root of 4, which is 2. Now we're ready to go ahead and finish solving for x, so we would add 1 to both sides. And in doing that, we end up with, our solutions are 1 plus or minus 2. And finally, we could say that x equals 1 plus 2, which is 3, or it equals 1 minus 2, which would be negative 1. And those would be your solutions there. And that works. Okay. So let's move on to another one. I've mentioned this in class, but I don't know that we've done enough of these to where we've had to consistently remember. For completing the square, a has to equal 1, okay? So that means your leading coefficient has to be a 1. If it's not, then you have to get rid of that before you proceed. So in this case, we're just going to divide every term before we start moving anything by 3. And we will rewrite, because that cancels that. Minus 2/3 x. I know you guys love the fractions. Minus 2/3 equals 4/3. So now we have our new equation. Now we're ready to start just like we did with the previous one. We need to get rid of the c value, move it to the other side before we start taking half of b and squaring it. So I'm going to do that. Adding 2/3 to both sides would result in a positive 2 here. If we added 2/3 to 4/3, we end up with 6/3, which simplifies to 2. Okay, so now we're ready to take half of b, which would be negative 2/3, and then square it. So over here, I'll kind of work that out. We've got negative 2/3. Remember that taking half of it is, dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So I'm going to multiply by 1/2, and I would get negative 2/6, and that will result in negative 1/3. And we are going to square that, and that's what's going to go over here in our whole. So negative 1/3 squared would be a positive 1/9. And again, we have to add that to both sides. So now we've got that. And now we're ready to factor. And this will factor into x minus 1/3 squared. Basically, your factorization is always going to be whatever the square root of this is. It'll always be the square root of your c value. Like here, we had square root of 25, which is 5, and then the sign on your b value pretty much determines the sign that's in there. So there's always that very specific pattern that follows. It's once you kind of get the get used to noticing those patterns, this will be much easier. And then we'll have equals 2 plus 1/9, and remember to add fractions, we have to have like denominators. So I'm going to turn 2 into something over 9, which would be 18/9. So this would be like adding 18/9 plus 1/9, which is 19/9. And now we are ready to take the square root of both sides. And move over to the right here. So now we have x minus 1/3 equals plus or minus the square root of 19/3. Now the reason why we have over 3 is because when we take the square root of a fraction, it's basically the square root of your numerator over the square root of your denominator. Yes, babe. Emmeline, I'm in here. Where? And then we add it to both sides. Where? Emmeline, I'm right here. Shh.
Here's Zacy, Mom.
Thank you.
She wants you.
Go. And you can leave your answer like this, or we can simplify it to 1 plus the square root of 19, plus or minus, let's do that. And those would be your answers.
Anna.
So there is that one there.